All right, today we're going to unpack one of the most improbable, truly mind-boggling national success stories of the 20th century, the story of Singapore. When you picture Singapore now, you're probably thinking of this, right? Gleaming skyscrapers, super clean streets, a global powerhouse for finance and trade. It's so successful that we kind of just take it for granted.
But, and this is the question that makes this whole story so fascinating, how did they do it? How did a tiny island with absolutely nothing, no resources, no army, deep racial divides, pull off this incredible transformation in just one generation?
So, let's get into it. The key to understanding Singapore is to forget everything about a grand plan for prosperity. That's not how it started. This story begins with one thing and one thing only: a desperate, raw fight for survival. And this quote from Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, just says it all. This was on August 9th, 1965, the day Singapore became a country, and he wasn't celebrating. He was on TV, openly weeping, calling his new nation a heart without a body. Just think about that image, a city completely cut off from everything it needed to survive.
Yeah, and this is a really important point. Singapore didn't fight for and win its independence. It was kicked out, thrown out of Malaysia. It was basically an unwanted nation and experiment everyone, and I mean everyone, expected to just collapse and fail. Its very existence was a total accident.
So when survival is your only goal, what's the first threat? Well, it's pretty simple: getting wiped off the map. You're surrounded by bigger, not-so-friendly neighbors. So the question is, how in the world do you defend a nation that doesn't even have an army?
And I'm not exaggerating when I say the situation was dire. Get this, Singapore had just 2 army battalions, and they weren't even controlled by Singapore. They answered to a Malaysian commander. They begged for help from countries like India and Egypt. Nothing. Crickets. They were completely, totally on their own, utterly defenseless.
So what do? Well, in a move of pure pragmatism, Lee Kuan Yew reached out to the one country that understood their situation perfectly: Israel, another small nation surrounded by hostiles. But bringing in Israeli military advisors would have been a huge problem with Singapore's Muslim neighbors. So they brought them in secretly, disguised as Mexicans. You can't make this stuff up.
And the key idea these Mexicans brought with them was national service. Basically, a system of compulsory military service for all young men. Seems straightforward, right? A quick way to build an army from scratch.
But here's where it gets brilliant. This wasn't just about building an army. It was a secret weapon for building a nation. Think about it. You take all these young guys, Chinese, Malay, Indian, who barely interact with each other, and you force them to live together, train together, rely on each other. It shattered those racial divides and started weaving the very first fabric of a common Singaporean identity.
Okay, so you've got a shield. That's great. But a shield doesn't do you much good if the country starves to death. Which brings us to the next massive problem: the economy, or the complete lack of one. How do you fix that?
Now, back in the 60s, there was this popular idea for developing countries called dependency theory. And the thinking went like this: you have to wall off your economy. Keep out the big multinational corporations, the MNCs, because they'll just come in, exploit you, and take all your stuff.
So what did Singapore do? They looked at that rule book and they threw it out the window. They did the exact opposite. Instead of protectionism, total openness. Instead of trying to compete with their neighbors on the same level, they decided to just leapfrog them entirely. And those big, scary MNCs, Singapore decided to roll out the red carpet and invite them in.
You see, Lee Kuan Yew had a really clear-eyed view of things. He knew Singapore had nothing for these companies to exploit, except for 2 things: hardworking people and a government that could absolutely guarantee stability and zero corruption. So he became the country's #1 salesman. He literally flew to America, walked into boardrooms, and personally pitched CEOs, telling them why this tiny, fragile island was the smartest, safest bet they could possibly make in the region.
All right, so you're building an army. You've got a radical economic plan. But what good is any of that if your society just implodes from the inside? And with those deep racial divides, that was a very real danger. This was the next monumental challenge. How do you engineer a cohesive society?
Lee Kuan Yew had seen the British welfare state up close, where the government provides for its citizens. And he thought, that's not going to work here. It creates dependency, and we can't afford that. So we went in a totally different direction. Forget a welfare state, Singapore was going to build a stakeholder society. The government's job wasn't to give you handouts, it was to give you a ladder, to help you own a piece of the pie for yourself.
And the main tool they used to do this, something called the Central Provident Fund, or CPF. Now, this was basically a forced savings plan. A huge chunk of every single worker's paycheck was taken out before they even touched it. I mean, that's a tough pill to swallow. But there was a very, very smart reason for this sacrifice.
And this is where the plan was just genius. First, all that forced savings created this giant pool of money inside the country. That's how they built all their amazing roads and ports without begging for foreign loans. But second, and this is the masterstroke, people could use that forced savings money to buy their own homes. All of a sudden, everybody, even the lowest paid worker, had a real path to owning their own apartment. And once you own a piece of the nation, you're not just a worker anymore. You're a stakeholder. You have something real, something tangible to protect and to fight for.
But hold on, let's be real. You can only ask people to make that kind of sacrifice on one condition. They have to trust you. They have to have absolute 100% faith that the government isn't corrupt and isn't going to squander their hard-earned money. And that kind of trust, it doesn't just happen. You have to earn it.
So Lee Kuan Yew launched an all-out war on corruption. It was zero tolerance. He empowered investigators to look into the bank accounts of any government official, no matter how powerful. They even flipped the burden of proof. If you were a minister and you suddenly had a fancy car and a big house that your salary couldn't explain, well, that was enough to be considered evidence of corruption. Nobody was untouchable.
And this wasn't just for show. The policy had serious teeth. There's this incredibly stark story from 1986. A very powerful minister was caught taking bribes, and instead of facing the public shame of a trial, he committed suicide. It was a horrible, tragic event, but it sent a chillingly clear message to the entire country. The system is absolute. The rules apply to everyone.
So fast forward to the 1980s. The pieces are in place. You've got security, you've got a booming economy, you've got a society that's starting to stick together. But that brings up the final, and maybe the toughest question for a founder like Lee Kuan Yew. How do you make sure this whole thing you've built doesn't just fall apart the second you're gone?
Well, his plan for the future had a few key parts. First, an obsession with developing people, human talent, because that was Singapore's only real resource. Second, a very smart language policy. English to connect with the world, and your mother tongue, be it Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil, to stay connected to your heritage. And maybe most critically, he started a relentless, merit-based search for the next generation of leaders to ensure a smooth, stable transfer of power, which happened right on schedule in 1990.
And that's how they did it. The impossible journey, from third world to first in a lifetime. But that leaves us with one last really interesting question. Singapore was built in a crisis, forged in fire, driven by this constant fear of just disappearing. So the question for today is, can a nation that was built on hardship survive the dangers of its own success? Can it handle wealth and comfort? That is the new challenge.